This is a series where I play and talk about some old video games. Lately, I've been dusting off my old Xbox 360 collection and getting back into some of my old favourites. I'll be replaying the first part of these games, and then we'll chat about what makes them special. Today, we're playing the Xbox 360's best launch title, and my favourite first-person horror game. Developed by Monolith Productions and released in 2005, we are heading to Metro City to unravel a gruesome mystery.
He's right above us! Call for backup now!
This is Officer Becker. We need backup immediately. 4th and Stark. Potential homicide suspect still in building.
Officers are on their way. ETA 10 minutes.
Copy that.
Becker and I will head up the fire escape. You wait here for backup.
I first experienced Condemned in 2006 when I rented it from my local Blockbuster to play over a weekend. At home with the game, I cranked the volume, killed the lights, and had a terrifying time. At the tender age of 15, Condemned scared the hell out of me, but it also sucked me into its world. I'd never played a game that got my adrenaline going the way that Condemned did.
Your cell phone. All right, let's get to work. Let's start by determining the cause of death.
Back then, I found horror movies dull or unpleasant, but there was something exhilarating in playing Condemned. Something about the player agency or having immersion through that horror experience really resonated with me. Diving back into Condemned this year, I set up the same way. I waited till night time, I cranked the volume, and I killed the lights. This time playing through, I wasn't as terrified though. I just had heaps of fun. During my recent playthrough, one thing stood out. Condemned is one of those rare and beautiful games that does immersion through gameplay. In this episode, I'm going to break down how Condemned achieves immersion through gameplay. We'll be talking about its great aesthetic design, enemy encounters, and its combat system. To wrap up this episode, I'll talk about the other elements of Condemned's design that I like, and cover a few things that didn't land with me. Some spoilers ahead. Let's talk about immersion through gameplay. Simply, I think immersion in a game is a measure of your personal investment in the world, story, and characters. Game immersion can take many forms. You might develop a strong attachment to a character, be emotionally affected by a significant event in the plot, or just feel like you're in the shoes of the protagonist that you're playing. Because immersion is a subjective, personal feeling, there's no perfect game design formula for it. Immersion can take different forms, and it can also be achieved in different ways. You can get there with terrific world design, great writing, quality performances, or through gameplay. For me, Condemned achieves immersion through gameplay. Specifically, its terrific close combat system. In Condemned, you play Ethan Thomas, an FBI agent investigating serial killings in Metro City. Metro City is a violent, decrepit place. It is a brutal, desperate city. And when you fight someone in Condemned, it is brutal and it is desperate. Condemned's combat feels this way because of its aesthetic design and its mechanics. Let's cover off on both of those points. Aesthetic design first. The enemies sound manic and wretched. Audio feedback is crunchy and sometimes nauseating. Lighting is dynamic, but dark and often oppressive. Environments are almost always some type of confined residential, commercial, or industrial cesspit. Enemies in Condemned are dirty, disturbing creatures made all the more nasty because they are rooted in reality. They look like vagrants, addicts, and outcasts, people failed by their government, wider society, or maybe their own choices. I won't harp too much on the aesthetic design because you can see and hear that throughout this episode. The takeaway point is it is excellent. So that's solid aesthetic design, covered off very briefly. That leaves us now more time to talk about the mechanics of Condemned's excellent combat. This is a game where homeless people beat each other to death with wooden planks, and occasionally they get interrupted by a rogue FBI agent who beats them both to death with a wooden plank while he's on the way to solve some serial killings. You wouldn't think there's a lot of depth or nuance to the mechanics of this game's combat system, but goddamn, there is. At its mechanical foundation, Condemned has tight responsive controls that strike a good balance between mobility and physicality. You're not very fast, but if your reactions are good, you are just agile enough to back up or sidestep enemies that take a swing at you. Enemies are also quicker than you over distance, so you can't run or hide from them. Building on that movement, Condemned's weapons are varied, unique, and deadly. To be honest, they're not even really weapons. Most of the blunt force and bladed instruments you will be swinging are everyday objects like pipes, shovels, wood, rebar. If you want to spice things up, maybe a fire axe, a subway sign, or a sledgehammer. Enemies will do the same. They will happily tear out an electrical conduit, plunging you into darkness on the road to plunging that piece of metal into your head. Guns are powerful but uncommon, and they're useless when they're empty. And overall, the weapons' variety and their everyday improvised nature contributes to the scrappy, hopeless feeling that's evident throughout the rest of Condemned's design. Movement and weapon mechanics sorted for now, let's quickly touch on the player and enemy combat mechanics. There are no elaborate combos or even heavy or light attacks in Condemned. You have your 4 core, directionally sensitive attacks, a block, a karate kick, a taser that recharges, and some executions for stunned enemies if you're feeling fancy. On the enemy side, they have access to the same environmental weapons and the same dynamic opportunities that you do to grab a weapon or an instrument from the environment around you. They have exactly the same core moveset except for the kick and the taser. They have their own special moves, however. They will rush you, lay a few hits in, then retreat, ambush you around corners. They can feint and recover from hits with wild, powerful swings. Some will lie in wait, others will crash through parts of the environment in order to get to you. They'll be silent when they're creeping around and loud as hell when they're brawling. Pretty soon, you're fighting more than one enemy at a time, and the fights get dynamic and frantic very quickly. Condemned combat is aligned with the feeling of the world because its aesthetic design is coupled really well with the mechanics we've just talked about. Weighty movement, weapons ripped out of walls, savage enemies. I hope that little discussion helps explain how I feel immersed through Condemned's gameplay. Condemned's confronting and morbid world is anchored and reinforced through its confronting and morbid combat. To help reinforce my point, I'll quickly shout out a few other games that I think achieve immersion through gameplay. Dead Space and Sunset Overdrive have combat systems that similarly evoke the feeling of the world. Away from combat, Outer Wilds and The Witness are examples of games that achieve immersion through exploration and puzzle-solving gameplay. These obviously aren't the only immersive games, but these are the games where I get that similar feeling that Condemned gives me. The feeling of being enveloped in the world through gameplay. That's the main thing I wanted to talk about here. I'll run through some other thoughts I have about the game and we'll wrap this whole thing up. Replaying Condemned is still a tense and sometimes scary experience. Enemies are unpredictable and erratic, which makes even standard encounters dynamic. Condemned really relies on jump scares, which I like. More often than not, it builds tension with ambient sound and environmental design. The abandoned department store, for example, has some excellent ambient audio. The horror in Condemned comes from a ever-present sense of dread, compounded by sudden, ferocious combat. Dynamic lighting helps hide the older textures and the wet clay-looking faces on most character models. Voice work of enemies is excellent, but the main character has a weird habit of sounding a little bit like Microsoft Sam at times.
Hello, Ethan.
Who are you? What is going on?
Calm yourself.
Greg Grunberg's performance as Ethan Thomas is a little bit stiff, but maybe that's some of the animation in the game selling him a little bit short.
Yes, I remember you.
The story is decent B-movie stuff, and it's well-paced and not too convoluted. Story-wise, it falls off towards the end, things get a little bit loose, and there's a player choice moment that winds up being meaningless. But hey, the supernatural elements throughout the game are just vague and disruptive enough that you can never be fully sure of your reality or get comfortable just facing off against human enemies. The forensic analysis sections are simple but appreciated gameplay breathers, where you can play CSI and unfurl the story a little bit more. One of the best horror moments in the game comes from one of these sections, but I won't spoil it here. There's some weird collectibles across the levels. Dead or dying birds, and scraps of metal. Nice. Fits with the overall aesthetic design. That's about it for Condemned. Condemned has the best first-person melee system of any game I've played. Released in 2008, the sequel made design, aesthetic, and gameplay changes that tore apart the immersive harmony that made the original so great.
We were good in the beginning, but you turned out to be kind of a failure.
For a 2005 Xbox 360 release title, it's incredible that Condemned's close combat and brawling gameplay remains unrivaled, even today. It plays and it feels unique. It has a strong identity. Replaying Condemned and discovering that immersive feeling still exists was a genuine pleasure for me. I cannot recommend this game highly enough. If you're not afraid of a taut, visceral experience, you'll love it. Thanks for listening, and take care.